This is your checking in. I'm over here grabbing some food. It's late at night, so I figured I'd go ahead and do it late instead of early to see if I could get some participation. I know when I come on early, not everybody's up, not everybody's doing, their thing. So maybe if I come on late, I'll be able to get a little bit more participation. So we're gonna try to do it late this time. I've got a few moments before my chicken will be ready. So we'll go ahead and get that taken care of too. Shabbat Shalom for anybody that is already celebrating. We do sunrise to sunset. So Shabbat Shalom to anybody that is already celebrating their Sabbath. All right, I hope everybody can see me. Gotta make sure I don't have anything in my beard. I've been doing some of these videos with big hairballs in my beard. It's embarrassing. But yeah, we wanted to get on here this time and switch topics to talk about something else that is just a concept that I don't think many people are familiar with, even though the story, the given narrative, we're all familiar with. We're all raised and trained, with this narrative in mind. But I don't think that the actual story behind what happened, is published as much. And so the gist of it is that we know that Ashkenazi people, who are called Ashkenazi Jews today, went through what is called a holocaust in Europe, in Germany and Austria and Poland, where the Nazi party, the leading party of Germany, led by the leading, dictator in Germany during the 40s, Adolf Hitler, launched this attack on the world, tried to take over the world, tried to purify the world to an all-white world, and not just any old type of white, this particular Aryan brand of white. And in doing so, he captured the Jews hostage in Germany and surrounding areas, and then put programs together to exterminate the Jews. And so this is what we see happening in the 1940s in Europe. We see one dictator rising and gaining a massive amount of power, and using that power to enslave and ultimately exterminate another group of Europeans, if that makes sense to you guys. If you can, look back to your middle school education, your excuse me, you guys. If you can look back to your middle school education, when we learned all these things, reading Anne Frank and really being horrified by the trauma of this event, of the Holocaust. We've been told that people were killed in gas chambers, that they were rounded up, put on trains like cattle, brought to concentration camps littered throughout Eastern Europe. Shalom, shalom, Mishpachah. I see we got one person on. So they were brought to concentration camps throughout Eastern Europe and cataloged for extermination. That's what we were told. So how much of that is actually true? How much do we look at as historical fact? And then what was the reasons behind it? What was the real purpose of what was going on? So just straight away, I will tell you I'm not a Holocaust denier. That you will have some people that are out there that say the Holocaust never happened, that none of the stuff that they're talking about in this section of history ever took place. But I'm not one of those guys. It's clear that there was a massive undertaking of people that are Ashkenazi Jews taken into prison and exterminated and killed on a massive scale, right? Now, was it 6 million Jews is the number that they give to you? Was it 6 million? No. I think the real number was around, I would say, 2 to 300,000 people we can provably say in history were killed during this time. And only about 175 of them in the concentration camps, in the program, um, in the programmed extermination with the gas and in the way that the cremation, that ran around the clock. Those things did happen. This is torturous. This is, just satanic and demonic on another level. But those things did happen, and they did happen to the Jewish people. And it's a very, very, very sad thing that this happened in the 1940s. It's just the calculated terror of the whole thing, horrified me as a kid. And I'm sure it traumatized and horrified, all of you guys that are out there. Because sure enough, did that to me. So what was the reason behind it? We can go into the history of the Ashkenazi Jews in Germany, how politically they railroaded the German people into wage slaves. Politically, they wrestled the German aristocracy, the German royalty, wrestled them into war in World War I, and the population really being, really distraught with the loss of World War I and being sunk into this depression in the early 1900s, that the entire population became fed up. Because it's clear, shalom, shalom, Mishpach, I see we got somebody on there. It's clear that Jewish interest and Jewish banking interest in Germany, Jewish merchants and Jewish newspapers controlled Germany, right? We see that in the early 1900s and even in the late 1800s, where the German population was really at the mercy of its Jewish inhabitants, economically, with the economic markets, financially, with the stock market, and of course, in the media as well, with them running mostly the newspapers that, instead of course, not the underground newspaper, but most of the propaganda, the media that comes out, designed by Jewish interests in both Germany and Russia at this time. So we see a real reason behind the hatred that the Germans had for the Jewish people. They definitely put them into the depression that they were in the 1920s. Of course, is that an excuse for mass genocide on a scale, never seen before? Absolutely not. But let's continue to talk about that, because there's another aspect that is being missed by most people when we talk about this Holocaust. So, shalom, shalom, Ishbakad. See, somebody else has joined in. We've got 3 people now. Hallelujah. We're getting some interaction here later than earlier. So if you guys want to meet up late, then we'll do that. So you have, in the 1920s and 30s, a real rising against Ashkenazi Jews in Germany in political parties. But again, you want to also understand that these politics, this media propaganda, was controlled. If it was controlled before in the early 1900s, it was then also controlled later in the mid 1900s, when we start to see the rise of Nazism, when we start to see the anti-Jewish sentiment in Germany, right? And so what happened, if I can go really informal with you guys to give you a picture of the events that take place in just Jewish history leading up to their time in Germany. You have all of these different Jews that spread out throughout Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe, Germany, and they start to make a name for themselves. You've got a big family called the Rothschilds. I know you guys have heard of the Rothschild banking cartel. This is when they began to set up uh, their banking systems in all of these different European nations. They had a banking system in France, in England, in Germany, in all of the places where they were. They established, the Rothschilds established a banking system. And this was a banking system that was run off of political intrigue, basically. They were able to take control of the finances of the governments of these countries. They became such influential bankers in the country that the government literally merged with these banking systems, and the banking systems became the driving force behind the governments, if that makes sense. And so in all these different places, not only were the banking systems and the economies controlled by the Rothschild family or by subsidiaries of the Rothschild family, and then thus also Ashkenazi Jews, but also the media was controlled. So everything that the people thought, experienced, and dealt with was on a Ashkenazi Jewish understanding. So you get to the point where, of course, people are very upset about that in all of these other different places, and they start getting kicked out of these places. Like, you can't come here, you can't come there. So they started to go to Germany in mass. A lot of Jews left Russia and went to Germany. In the First World War, this is the end of the Russian oligarch, the Russian monarchy, being killed. The Ashkenazi Jews are behind that. This is the communism, the Bolshevikism. This is Stalin and Lenin, and all these are, if I'm not mistaken, Lenin is Ashkenazi Jewish. The Russian government at that time, the one that was established in communism and Bolshevikism, was Jewish. It was just a Jewish organization, and this is fleeing from, the the blame of destroying the Russian monarchy. A lot of the Jews went to deeper into Europe. And so they start causing lots of trouble there in Germany and all of these different places like we were talking about. So, question comes up. Are we going to try to find a homeland? There was a guy named Theodore Herzl, and he's early on, right? I believe he's even before, he's before all this, maybe even 100 years. No. Yeah, I think he's right there at the end of the turn of the century, around there. But he starts to promote a concept known as Zionism. He starts to say that the Jewish people who are in this extensive diaspora, and this is the Ashkenazi Jewish people only, the European Jews only, he starts to write that the Jewish people in the diaspora need to be established in their own homeland. And so the call goes out worldwide to these Ashkenazi Jews to start looking and planning for a way that we can, or they can, establish themselves a homeland. And where might that be? Because it seems like we're getting kicked out of a lot of places based on our meddlings with economic interest and governments in these places. And of course they were. And so they started looking to other countries in order to take them over and establish for themselves what they called a Jewish homeland, right? And so they looked a lot of places. The place that they didn't look originally, though, was Jerusalem, Israel, where it is, where we know it to be. They didn't look there. They didn't consider that as an option for a Jewish homeland. Do you see what I'm saying? That was out of the question. At that time, another Gagite group, the Ottomans, the Turks, had control over Jerusalem. And the Muslim world was very strong, very vast, and very set on having Israel as their homeland. And so that part was they couldn't just say, okay, well, we're going to just go back to Jerusalem. For one, they had never been there in the first place. for two, they couldn't, because that area was controlled by a very, very vast and powerful and quote unquote Hebraic or Abrahamic people, quote unquote. Again, that's also false history. That's really the same style of false history. Um, but so Theodore Herzl is coming together with different minds in Ashkenazi Jewish thought, right? Having councils and conferences in these different parts of the world to try to figure out and see where they could go to establish themselves a place where they wouldn't be ran out of. And so this is when the Uganda scheme comes to fruition. Have you guys heard of the Uganda scheme? If you look it up, it's literally called the Uganda scheme, but it's a plan made by Zionist Jews and this is either in the very, very early 1900s or in the 1800s, the late 1800s, maybe even earlier than that. Didn't, I usually try to do these talks organically to where that I can just rely on my memory and then do the research, the research that I normally do. Instead of really preparing for a talk, I like to be able to have the knowledge and be able to speak freely on the knowledge without having to, necessarily look up online, okay, show you this is where this is, or even go to the text, like in the Bible. I like to have it memorized well enough to be able to navigate it. So I can't remember exactly when the Uganda scheme was. It may have been in the late 1800s or the early 1900s, but it was well before the concept of Ashkenazi Jews being in Jerusalem and in Israel was a thing, right? So they, they write up documents, they write the whole scheme down, which ends up being called the Uganda scheme, to where that they could get this land in Africa and set this African land aside to be the state for Zionist Jews, or for all Ashkenazi Jews in the world to return to. And they planned on making this happen. They set aside this amount of land in Rwanda, actually, and not Uganda. It's called the Uganda scheme for some reason or another, but the land was actually in Rwanda. And they put it together. They were getting ready to go through with it. But the plan ended up falling through because a better plan came along. Do you see what I'm saying? With their control of England, with their control of America, with their control of Germany, with their control of Russia, they saw an opportunity in World War I to conquer Jerusalem. Do you see what I mean? People are distracted in World War I by the conflict with Germany, right? Germany was the big loser in World War I. They come up, as into a depression after they lose this war. But there was a whole other front against the Ottomans in Egypt and in Israel. And if you guys are familiar with the Balfour Declaration, do you guys know what the Balfour Declaration is? It's where this guy, I think his name is Arthur Balfour, who was a leader in England. Remember, all of these nations are involved in World War I. England, Germany, America, Russia, all the major players are involved. And then, of course, Germany comes out the loser in it, paving the way for World War II and all the atrocities that we see in World War II, right? The Jews are right at the center of all of this, right? So you see what is called the Balfour Declaration happening in, I think it's 1913 or 14, maybe 15, around that time. And the Balfour Declaration is at the end or the closing of World War I, when it's clear that England has gotten a foothold in Jerusalem, and it was clear that they were conquering Jerusalem. That England in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, conquered Jerusalem, and the Ottoman Empire as it was known, falls. Do you understand what I mean? People are distracted by the things going on in Europe and Russia for World War One, but that wasn't the point of World War One at all. It was to conquer Jerusalem. And that's what England quietly does, as a side note to the rest of the atrocities that were going on for World War One. You remember World War One is trench warfare, chemical warfare. Some of the most egregious events in humankind happened during this time. You had, millions of people fighting and dying for nothing, basically for, Ashkenazi Judaism to conquer Jerusalem. And that's what happens. When these figures, when these world powers like France, Germany, England were able to be manipulated in such a way, they decided that, hey, why go into Uganda and into Rwanda to set ourselves a piece of land? We could do that if we wanted to, but why don't we just go for the gold? People believe we are these people already. Why don't we just go and conquer Jerusalem? And so they began to do that with this Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour actually declares Jerusalem to be the property of Lionel Rothschild. You see what I'm saying? This is a English politician who is writing a declaration of ownership to a private citizen, Lionel Rothschild. And this is where we see the power of this Rothschild family, the power of this Ashkenazi Jewish family, where you see that power come into play and really show itself, because it showed that it was able to manipulate England into conquering Jerusalem on behalf of this particular group of people. So when they say, oh, well, it's a surprise that America is run by these Jews, that Benjamin Netanyahu is ordering around the president and they're sending $20 billion of arms to protect this place, it's actually been happening for about 100 years in that same fashion. With England and France and the United States and all of these different countries actually cooperating behind the scenes with Ashkenazi Jews in very high positions and developing these areas for Jews to operate in, like Hollywood, like the music industry, like Israel right now. Do you see what I'm saying? And so with this new plan to come in place, they knew they couldn't just upend and take the country without having some sort of reasoning behind it, right? They couldn't come in and just say, oh, this is now our country, because again, they would be looked at like the Nazis were looked at. And I'm talking about from the Balfour Declaration going forward. So in the 1910s, in the 19 teens, the Jews had known that they controlled Jerusalem, but they couldn't en masse move in because it would have looked like a Nazi invasion, right? Like when the actual Nazi invasion happened about 30 years later when Germany invaded Poland. That's what it would look like, right? And so they didn't want to look like that. So they had to stage some sort of psychological event for the people to accept a Jewish state. Do you see what I'm saying? You have to understand at this time, this was the pinnacle of psychological research and experimentation. You've got Carl Jung and you've got Sigmund Freud. Do you see what I'm saying? All of these top-notch psychologists coming out of Germany, being some of them Ashkenazi Jews themselves, and designing psychological, I guess you could call them, there's a lot of words that people use for them, mind viruses, propaganda styles, spells, but it just boils down to these psychologists developing programs or schemes that will be able to work with a person's own emotions in order to accomplish a mission, right? So all of this is going on in Germany. All of this mind science is being developed in Germany at the time, right? And so what they did was they developed a plan for the world to feel sorry. And if you guys have any questions at all about any of these things, we can definitely answer these questions too. But so the mind science starts to be designed to put Jews in Jerusalem. Since now they have control of Jerusalem through England, they want to start going back there. Even though they're in control of it, it doesn't appear that way because all of the people that are there in Jerusalem, in Israel, are still Ottoman people, are still Turks, right? The people that conquered Jerusalem way back when in the 900s, right? And ran off the people that were there, the remnants of the Romans, the remnants of the last of the Judeans, if there were any left in that time, just the remnants of the mixed group of people that were in Jerusalem, the Romans, Greeks, and other tribes of people that were not Israelite tribes, ran them on out and conquered Jerusalem in the name of Islam, right? So that's what happened in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD. And so ever since then, Islam has controlled Israel. But now, in the turn of the 19th century, we have that changing, and these Ashkenazi Jews coming into power and taking control of Israel, of Jerusalem, and wanting to put their people back there. So what ends up happening is they develop this plan to make the world feel as if they need Israel to be in Israelite territory. And so there was another problem that they had. And this plan, was was an evil, evil, evil plan. But let me tell you, it worked. And it required all of these, occultic themes in order for it to work, including mass murder being an occultic theme, right? So just to explain the situation of Zionism in the past 200-300 years or so, as it's being created and developed, Zionism is literally the political structure or the ideology that states that Israelites, particularly Ashkenazi Israelites, will have and will establish a Jewish homeland, right, for Ashkenazi Israel. That is Zionism. And this concept, this ideology, this political structure had its opponents, right? It had its opponents in the Ashkenazi Jewish diaspora. And not just a small group of people. We see Zionism today is very, very popular in Ashkenazi Israel, and is really the main political structure in Ashkenazi Israel today. There's nobody really opposing Zionism. If so, a very, very small minority of people that are opposing it, right? There are people that are opposing it today. I'm not going to say that there's not Jews themselves opposing Zionism. It's a very small minority. Back then, back 200 years ago, it was not a small minority. It was about 50%, right? You had it split half and half of people who were pro-Zionist, saying that, yes, we should establish a Jewish homeland. It became a Jewish homeland in Israel, because at first it was just a Jewish homeland. And then there was just a very, very large contingent of people that said, no, that's not something that we want to do. That we do not need a Jewish homeland. We are good in this diaspora, right? Who are we going to take a Jewish homeland from, right? And so you had two very, very large and equally vociferous groups of people, both of them speaking out about what they believed in, and the benefits of a Jewish homeland versus the negatives of a Jewish homeland. You had most secular Ashkenazi Jews that were pro-Zionist, right? And which is strange, because Zionism is supposedly a religious type thing. You ended up having a lot of religious Jews being, anti-Zionist. Just a strange thing. And I'll explain to you why. It became more clear, later on when it appears that the opportunity, it became more clear later on when it appeared to mainstream Jewry, was what they call it, that the opportunity would be in place to take Jerusalem, that these anti-Zionists became even more profoundly against Zionism and even more speaking out against Zionism. And you never know, because I did all this research a long time ago, and I found all these things out and started to wonder, okay, if these people really believe themselves to be Jews, why would there be such thing as an anti-Zionist? And especially with it being half of the population, at some points in history, more anti-Zionist than Zionists. Zionism started small at first. Do you see what I'm saying? Especially around the time when Israel became available for capture. People began to say, no, we are non-Zionists. We do not want this to happen, right? We don't want you to take Jerusalem. We don't want to be established in Israel because this would be problems for us, right? What problem would the non-Zionists have with the Zionists establishing a home for Israel in Israel? What problem could they have with that? If they believe themselves to be actual descendants, why would they want to not be in their own land? Why would they not historically or religiously pursue their own land, right? Why not? Why be happy where you are? The reason why is because, like we all know now, they all knew then that they were late converts. Do you understand what I mean? The prophecy about Israel returning to Israel from the diaspora is a prophecy that happens at the time of the Messiah's return. This is a prophecy that happens after the anti-Messiah has come on the scene. And these Ashkenazi Jews, quote unquote, don't believe in the New Testament, even though they know it to be true. They quote unquote don't believe. But even in the Old Testament, it says Gog and Magog gotta be there first. They gotta be, all of these things have to happen before Israel will be able to be in the land. And if Israel is in the land, now listen to this part, if Israel is in the land early, right? If they're in the land with no Messiah, if they're in the land with no Gog and Magog, if they're in the land living safely, not living safely, do you see what I'm saying? At odds with each other, at odds with the people in the area, terrorism and war all around them, then it's going to be very, very clear that they are not Israelites, right? If they go into Israel too soon, the prophecy can't be fulfilled in them because Messiah has to take them in there. There has to be an outpouring of support from the world, just carrying them in to Jerusalem after turmoil, after this big war, after all of these evil and negative things happen to them. And then they are carried into Jerusalem on the backs of Gentiles. Then these things happen. Do you see what I'm saying? So what they had to do, what these Zionists had to do, was formulate a way for the world to feel sorry for them. And what they saw in this large group of anti-Zionists was a sacrificial lamb, was a scapegoat. Do you see what I'm saying? You really have to put all the pieces together to understand the way that this plan came to be. Because this interpretation is the way that it has to have been. We understand there was a Holocaust. We understand that a lot of Jewish people died. That fact doesn't jive with the fact that they also controlled the world at this time to a lesser extent then than they do now, but to a very powerful extent. If the Rothschild banking family was in control of the British Crown, was in control of the French government, because they no longer had a monarchy, their monarchy being taken down was the responsibility of the Ashkenazi Jews too. If they were in charge of the Russian government, whose monarchy was taken down because of because of those Russian Jews that were there, if they're in charge of the American government through England, if they're in charge of all of these places and people groups, then how could this huge Holocaust happen? Those two things should cancel each other out. Okay, well, the Jews must not be in control because this horrible thing happened to the Jews, right? So this is where we get the psychological intrigue that they inserted into this plan, right? So the plan is like this. What they decided, what they conceived of is that they decided to deceive Germany to take out their political enemies. Guys, what you don't understand is the Holocaust was against non-Zionist Jews. Do you understand that some people left Germany before the Holocaust? Some people left Austria before the Holocaust. Some people left Poland before the Holocaust. Some people left for America before any of these things were said to have been in play, before anybody knew of these things. In fact, one of the people, just to prove that what I'm saying is not crazy, bogus stuff, one of the people that left, one of the groups that left, had one person in it that you guys will all recognize, and you will all immediately recognize and say, yeah, you know what? That is kind of strange that he made it out before all this stuff took place. One person that made it out was Albert Einstein. Do you understand what I'm saying? Albert Einstein was a German Jew. He made it out well before the Holocaust, well before the war, and was able to look back and say, oh, I made it. Do you see what I'm saying? What ended up happening is he got the memo, being anti-religious but pro-Zionist. Do you see what I'm saying? He got the memo to get out of town before these things start. And so what the Zionist Jews did, who had control of the media, who had control of the economy, who had control over the finances in all of these different countries, these banking systems, they crashed Germany at the end of the war. They crashed it and had the German people living hand to hand. Then they put an explosive leader with supposedly Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. You understand that they say that that Hitler is Ashkenazi Jew through a Rothschild, that he's a Rothschild love child, that one of the servants in the Rothschild household was the grandmother of Hitler. Do you see what I'm saying? That there is a grandmother that's a servant in this powerful Jewish family that ends up being their ancestor ends up being the leader of Germany, leading the German people to exterminate this large group of Jewish people who just so happen to be the political enemies of another large group of Jewish people. Do you see what I'm saying? So what happened is that they trained Hitler to go in and conquer Germany, steer the German people towards genocide, and create this nation full of assassins, right? This national genocidal mania to provide the excuse for the takeover of Jerusalem. Do you see what I'm saying? So after World War II, after all of these atrocities were discovered, and after the world said, look at what had happened to these Jewish people, which did happen, they said, now this is too much. These people are persecuted too much. They're being shocked and traumatized by this great trauma. We have to help these people, and we have to help them in the right way. Let's help them into Israel where they belong anyway. And just 3 years after the close of the war, from 1945 to 1948, you have the establishment of the Jewish state. Do you understand? That's a plan that took 65 years to accomplish. 65-year plan that took multiple generations to accomplish this thing. And they used their political enemies as the whole burnt offering in order to appease whatever deity that they worship, and then also set off this psychological trauma on the world, which gives them the excuse to waltz into Jerusalem. Do you see what I'm saying? The word Holocaust literally means whole burnt offering. Holocaust means whole burnt offering, as if the people that were in the Holocaust were a sacrifice. They're using even the terminology that you would use if these people were sacrificed for a point, if they were sacrificed for a political purpose. And if you've noticed, the Ashkenazi Jews have used the point of the Holocaust in every situation going forward as leverage. In any conversation ever, they've used the Holocaust as leverage. They've used it as a spell. And the ultimate goal of this spell was to be able to take Jerusalem, which is what they did. They took it because they took it back in 1910, but they took it publicly in 1948. Do you see what I'm saying? And so this is the real history of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the Jews that are around today, the Ashkenazi Jews that are in Israel now, using their own people as a sacrificial lamb to start to take over the country and to end a war by taking over this country. Sound familiar? What do you think happened on October 7th? They did it again. Have you guys seen the reports that most of the people that were killed on October 7th in the so-called attack that allowed them to enter into Gaza, most of the people that were killed at the concert and all of the stuff that we know of from October 7th, most of the people were killed by Israeli helicopters. That Israeli helicopters did not, and this is public information, public knowledge, Israeli helicopters did not differentiate between partygoers, between Israelites, and between terrorists. They said that Israeli helicopters were responsible for killing up to 1,000 of the 1,200 people that were killed on that day. Up to 1,000 of the 1,200 were killed by just the helicopters. So again, they've killed their own people on a public stage and used this death in order for their own personal advantage. Do you see what I'm saying? This is how we know that this group of people is just as willing to kill their own kind as they are with any other people too. You're dealing with some really wicked people right now, and what is to come is going to be something worse than what they've already done. Do you see what I'm saying? And I don't know what they've got planned in the future coming down our way, but we only know of these things from what happens to us afterwards, right? We know of the after effects like COVID. We know of the after effects like the crack epidemic. We know of the things that come later, right? And so we understand history from this understanding. You can't say that Jews have controlled the media for the past 100 years, but then they suffered this huge loss 50 years ago. That doesn't correlate unless you know them for who they are and for what they do. If you know the Samson option in Israeli government right now is the option that they have to at any time use their own people's death as collateral. Do you understand? If they start losing any war, they start bombing themselves. Do you see what I'm saying? This is what's called the Samson option. It's in Israeli government right now. It's a war tactic that they've already dreamt up, written down on paper, and exercised. Do you see what I'm saying? Because they knew that they had gotten away with this exact thing in the 40s, and it worked. You see what I mean? They had manipulated all the German people to do exactly this thing for revenge, and it actually worked against them, because here they are still, 60 years later, 80 years later, servants of the Ashkenazi people. Do you see what I mean? Especially now, since the the Holocaust is in Germany's history. That's a noose around Germany's neck at all times, right? But this will make the stage of the world that is to come, because that Nazi propaganda ideology is still out there and it's still being used in order to have, you know, basically stormtroopers to work at the bidding of the Jews. This is how Gog and Magog works, as separate entities doing separate things, but also together doing the same thing, leading towards the end of the world, you guys. Okay, I hope that made sense to you guys that are out there. If there are any questions, please leave them in the chat box. This is a very controversial subject. I mean, it's not every day when you'll hear somebody say, in fact, I've never heard this alternative revision of the Holocaust, which can only be, this is the only scenario that could possibly be the case. Any other scenario doesn't make sense. But I've never heard this revision online at all, anywhere. This is something that comes originally from doing the research and putting the pieces together, with all the information that we have about the character of the Ashkenazi Jews, about the history of the Ashkenazi Jews, and about the facts behind the scenes for what people aren't putting together in one fluid story. So this is how that worked. This is how the Holocaust was designed, was implemented, and then is now still being used to conquer the world mentally so that they can have a foothold in Jerusalem. And anybody that has a foothold in Jerusalem at any point in time in history rules the world. You guys understand? Okay, that's all I got. We're right at 47 minutes. It's a little bit long, but I hope it made sense to you guys. Okay, shalom, shalom.